Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to walk you through the world economy, the risk and the threats over the next few years. So it's like going to be looking at like a near-term and a long-term view of the economy. Here's a little bit about myself. I'm a CPA, CGA by trade, but I've got a wide range of experience from academia to IT solutions to financial reporting cycles. My agenda will be is I'll look at growth by various countries. I'll look at carbon tax threat. I'll look at housing affordability, global trade, wage stagnation. Then I'll come to some conclusions of issues facing all governments around the world, whether they're municipal, provincial, state, or federal. What's the big issue here? You're going to hear a lot of different Banks of Canada comments, the Federal Reserves, just world economists giving you their take on things. And like anything else, economics isn't an exact science. You look at graphs, you look at trends, and you try to run inference on those graphs. But what I can say to you that we're hitting in an era now that instability from geopolitical events to higher taxation rules to the overall affordability and the cost of living is starting to become just unaffordable for generations of people. And that's something to bear in mind as you're looking through to see what's going to happen in the trends over the next year or two. So GDP forecast is about 3.5 global GDP. And what they do is they take all the countries together and they average them out. So you're going to have some ones that are having high growth like India, and you have some other countries like Japan that are pretty well stagnant growth. So these are things to do to kind of take in consideration when you're dealing with things. Every government's role is not that they have total responsibility for the economy, but what they have the responsibility to set policies. And some of those policies are critical, from regulations to hydro rates to taxation to wage and price controls. Anything like that can have an impact on how business operates as well as impact on consumer pricing. And if you take more money from people, that means less money gets put back in the economy. If you heavy regulate stuff, that means businesses will look elsewhere or have to spend more money on regulations. I brought in the carbon tax threat because the key aspect of everything else around the world, you're going to have different people talk about carbon tax. The reality is for carbon tax to be totally effective, the threshold would have to be significantly, like 2,500 to 4,400 per ton. The reason I say that is you basically have to take people that don't want to drive anymore off the road. But that has a ripple effect because the integrated supply chains still depend on oil-based delivery mechanisms. So if you're going to start to do that, then you're going to have a ripple effect. No government around the world will go to a carbon tax of that significant nature. Most of the reason why they're doing these carbon taxes is to play for votes. So they're trying to show that they're interested in the environment, but in essence, they're only playing a game of smoke and mirrors. And that's what you're really seeing in terms of things. And in Canada's case, is the federal government's going through a process to force carbon tax on the provinces, which again goes against the mandate of what Mr. Trudeau was trying to do initially when he got elected. Said he'd work with the provinces. When you start forcing regulations down the provinces without working with them, then you're creating an atmosphere where you're going to create resentment. And in 2019, Canada goes to the polls. Housing affordability is creeped up around the world. Some of the worst markets are Australia, Canada, New Zealand. The reason I bring that up is significant amount of your after-tax now income is tied up into just maintenance, mortgage, property taxes, hydro rates, and everything else. So if you've got so much tied up in just living, you have less money to spend on other necessities in life, whether that means food, whether it means entertainment, etc. It means you're going to have less to do things. And the idea that we're now heading to a period now of higher interest rates is on the horizons. Now, banks across the world, the government controls, who sets the interest rates, are basically looking at basically gradually phasing them up. The reason why is because household debt around the world is basically significant. And if you start putting interest rates up there, you're putting people over the fiscal cliff. And that's something that the various governments are really understanding in terms of their flow. The other issue come into play is the U.S. under Donald Trump is taking a significant approach to reducing the trade deficits with key countries like China. Now, the whole idea of integrated trade, which started more so in the 90s when China started becoming an economic powerhouse, and as well as manufacturers were looking at low-cost producing countries to bring in goods and services as part of keeping consumer prices down. The key aspect here is it has to be fair trade. Now, putting tariffs on anything like that doesn't do anything to solve the problem. All it does is kind of put a stopgap. It forces all the prices up. So there needs to be a fair trade system here. Now, the idea was the World Trade Organization was supposed to come in play to assist with this. Well, WTO has failed on its mandate because emerging countries like China do not follow all the rules that the WTO sets out as part of trying to make trade more fair and more equitable to countries, and you're seeing that. This particular chart shows you how much countries depend on exports. Canada, it's about 25% of our GDP. It's tied to export, and about 75% of those goods and services go to one country. You can't get away without talking about wage stagnation. Now, for the last 2 decades, wage growth has barely kept up with inflation. So the more you have inflationary pressures, the more it means people are left behind. Their dollars are not catching up to the cost pressure, the cost of living. And it's a bit significant. As you can see here, in terms of where we were from 2007 to 2017 and 2007. So the reason that period is selected is 2008-2009 range is when we had a recession. So you're seeing since basically 2007, wages have barely grown. And inflation in a lot of cases is 1.5% to 3% in a lot of those countries. So you're seeing that you're not keeping pace with inflation. And that's a significant issue because if you get less money and things are going up, you have to make strategic decisions on how you run your household budget. And in most cases, retail sales are a significant portion in terms of what we call consumer spending of the overall GDP. And if consumer spending starts to lag, then it's going to put pressure on other sectors. And that's one thing to bear in mind. So in conclusion, what can I say here? Governments around the world are fiscally restrained. Most governments are either in a heavy deficit or have a small surplus. The ability to deliver programs and a value for money seems to go out the door with governments. In the case of Canada, we're in a growth phase of the GDP, but yet the government of Canada is running close to $18 billion deficits. Normally, in good times, you shouldn't be running deficits, but Trudeau decided that we needed to do a stimulus. Europe is still a bit of a mess. You still have a lot of issues here, from the failed immigration strategy to key countries where economic growth has gone to low-cost producing countries. So you're left with these seasoned economies that are struggling just to keep up with the employment from the people, the students coming into the workforce, as well as new immigrants. The carbon tax agenda is also causing issues. It's all part of Agenda 2030, which is one world government. And you need to understand that is it's basically doesn't work, carbon tax. As much as people will try to sell it to you, it doesn't work. It's not effective unless you make the threshold higher. Governments around the world are not dealing with systemic issues with housing affordability, whether it's from urban planning, whether it's basically looking at the overall process in terms of how housing starts in from the building permits to the raw materials and all that. They're not getting a handle of it. You can expect interest rates to rise. That's inevitable. When you start seeing interest rates go up a quarter to that, that's significant depending on your household debt. countries around the world like India and China have to open up their borders, and they also have to be in a situation where they're basically allowing more fair investment. India and China are countries that need to respect more IP, but they also need to make sure that they allow more free flow of imports coming to their country. The whole world talks about poverty reduction. As Margaret Thatcher said, you know, the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money. So that being said, to beat poverty, then you're going to have multiple policies in play to do it, from a housing strategy to an economic strategy to a skills management strategy. There has to be alignment. You can't just say arbitrarily you're going to reduce poverty by 50% unless you have significant policy change or shift in government. In case of the Liberals and the other country, carbon taxes are a regressive tax. It hurts the low to middle class people more because that tax is passed on as part of the supply chain. That's never discussed by government. And it's never been, a carbon tax has never been revenue neutral, so you need to understand that. Now, I don't want to put the fear and doom in everybody. Economies go through cycles. The world goes through cycles on geopolitical events. But it needs to be people to be cognizant of major factors that are going to drive things, whether that's your small business, whether you're a large corporation, whether you're looking at your retirement down the road, or whether you're looking at buying a house. It's very critical to understand the dynamics of the marketplace. Thank you.